Apple only shows off its finished products, which makes the early concepts and abandoned designs all the more fascinating. Details about these products that never came to be don't come out for years after the fact. So today I'm going to walk through 40 years of the 8 craziest unreleased Apple products. After the first couple models of the Macintosh shipped, by the end of 1984, Apple executives started to make a plan for what would come to replace the Macintosh. Wait, what? That's crazy, right? Well, in the 70s and 80s, it was actually pretty common for a company to put out a few different models of similar machines and then replace it with something entirely different that would break compatibility. So it actually wasn't out of the question that a few years after the Macintosh, even after all that research and development, Apple would sell a completely different computer. The Macintosh was approachable and easy to use, but it wasn't as expandable as the Apple II. And it wasn't as powerful as some of the high-end machines from Sun, Amiga, and DEC. Apple's idea to bring the best of these all together was a concept called the Apple Jonathan. With these modules that were about the size of a hardcover book, you could easily configure a machine within your budget to your taste, and in the future you could upgrade it or add more modules with a hard drive, better graphics, upgraded storage, or even third-party accessories. And of course, because it was a professional computer, it was black. Such a machine would have been highly ambitious to engineer, especially in the 1980s. Apple would never make anything like it, nor would any other computer manufacturer. In reality, the Macintosh won out after all, although Apple expanded the lineup to start at the low-range Macintosh Plus, the mid-range Macintosh SE, and the gigantic, top-of-the-line Macintosh 2. Another experiment in the Macintosh form factor came in the mid-90s with the Apple Paladin, which takes the idea of an all-in-one computer to the next level. This Mac comes with a built-in phone, scanner, and fax machine. It's peak 90s. You'd be able to switch between all these functions using the buttons right there on the face of the machine. This would be targeted at small businesses who want all these features, but on a tighter budget, with just one purchase. It also could have been targeted at people who would find the process of buying a PC tower, monitor, keyboard, mouse, fax machine, printer, scanner, phone a little too intimidating. The mind races imagining just how fast Steve Jobs would have destroyed it with a baseball bat if he ever saw one. The smartphone before the smartphone was the PDA, or Personal Digital Assistant. The Palm Pilot was the most famous example. Apple's offering was called the Newton Message Pad. It was the personal passion project of then CEO John Sculley, who was trying to make his own mark on the company. The Apple Newton was roughly the size of an iPad mini, or in other words, just slightly too big to fit in a normal pocket. But the original prototypes included a much bigger version too. The screen is about the size of a letter sheet of paper, with even bigger black bezels, expanding it into a sprawling tablet. This isn't a PDA you whip out to jot down a few notes. This is a tablet you set up on a desk. Early versions of the Apple Newton famously failed to live up to the promise of truly seamless handwriting recognition, as they were mercilessly mocked for. Later versions of the Apple Newton, like the Message Pad 2000 that were more powerful, were actually pretty good devices that did everything they were set out to do. But of course, the one feature that would have been a killer app for these PDAs hadn't been invented in the mid-90s, and that would have been Wi-Fi. Maybe if the Newton had a little more time, a larger, more powerful, tablet-sized version could have been feasible as a product. Now, little did people know that just a few years after the Newton was discontinued, Apple once again started working on touchscreen tablets as early as 2002. And this prototype looks very much like a member of the Apple family of the era. You can imagine it fitting in perfectly next to the classic white iPod, iMac G4, and iBook. It's about as thick as a laptop from the early 2000s, but without a giant array of ports and slots. The sleek white case looks incredibly modern, and that thin black border around the all-screen design looks uncannily similar to today's iPad Pro. Older resistive touchscreens used in the Apple Newton, Nintendo DS, and higher-end cars before the advent of the modern smartphone required a stylus for smaller screens and couldn't support multi-finger gestures. Screens that you could just tap instead of poke were actually a very exciting technological development. According to Scott Forstall, the former Apple executive, in an interview given on the 10th anniversary of the iPhone, the very first tech demo of this involved a ceiling-mounted projector pointed down at a table-sized capacitive surface, running an early version of Mac OS X, to try out interactions like swiping to scroll or dragging a window to move it around. It's unknown to this day just how developed this prototype was. There are no pictures of it running, so it's safe to assume it wasn't functional at all. It wouldn't be until years later that the idea came around to shrink down the tablet into a phone-sized device, and another 3 years later that the tablet as originally envisioned would ship. In the 2000s, Apple's bread and butter was the iPod, and Apple executives were aggressively trying to turn that enthusiasm into sales for the Mac to gain back some PC market share. The thinking was that as people go into the Apple Store to check out the iPod, to try and sell them on the Mac as well. The face of this campaign was the Mac Mini. For just $4.99, Apple's cheapest Mac ever, you could literally unplug your PC and plug in a Mac instead with the same display, keyboard, and mouse. And what better way to show off that the Mac Mini is the iPod computer than to build an iPod Nano dock into the Mac Mini? You can just imagine how these would be perfectly lined up in the Apple Store, right between the table with the iPods and all the other Macs. But it does beg the question, what happens if you have a full-size iPod and not an iPod Nano? What if Apple changes the design of the iPod Nano, as they would just a few years later? But above all else, what probably killed it is that when you don't have an iPod plugged into it, you just have a weird hole in the top of your Mac Mini, and Steve Jobs would have found that unacceptable. Once Steve Jobs and Scott Forstall decided that Apple should make a phone, there were two obvious paths forward. Either they could take that tablet concept from earlier and shrink it down into a handheld device, or they could take the existing iPod and add a phone onto it. They weren't sure which would be the better approach, so they set up two teams in parallel to try both ideas. The iPod team had a head start because the iPod was already a fully developed product, and it was proven to be popular among consumers. All they really had to do was add a cellular radio and add a new interface for it. But according to former Vice President Tony Fadell, that's where the problems immediately became apparent. Because while the iPod's click-wheel interface is great for scrolling through a giant list of music, it was reportedly terrible at dialing phone numbers. The iPod is a consumption device. You organize and manage your music on your Mac, you browse and listen to it on your iPod. The iPod doesn't have a keyboard for dialing in phone numbers, much less texting or creating contacts. From a modern perspective, an iPod phone sounds absolutely ridiculous, but bear in mind that from 2004's perspective, the iPhone we ended up with wasn't guaranteed to work either. Mac OS X was barely running on full-size desktop computers, never mind handheld battery-powered devices. And Mac OS X was also in the middle of a processor transition from PowerPC to Intel. The ARM chip that the iPhone ran on would represent a third platform that a lot of the same software would have to be compiled for. The silly idea of an iPod phone was immortalized in the iPhone's actual introduction as a joke by Steve Jobs before he unveiled the real thing. But how did we end up on that original iPhone? Because once Apple settled on a software stack, the matter of its physical shape became something of a design playground. Some of these early prototypes look a bit familiar. This slick black rounded design became the iPhone 3G and 3GS. This ice cream sandwich sort of design eventually became the iPhone 4 and 4S. And even this early, you can see echoes of the iPhone 5 and 5S with these prototypes that have taller, skinnier displays. A lot of these early designs are clearly influenced by the iPod, with square corners that are rounded along the edges, an aluminum face instead of a black plastic face, a sliding power switch instead of a clicking button. Some of them even have menu written on the home button, instead of the iconic rounded rectangle. There are some truly bizarre one-off designs in there as well, like this one that's octagonal, this one that has a giant rounded hump on the back. So while the 2007 iPhone might not have been the prettiest, it does go to show that, in Apple's own words, there really are 1,000 no's for every yes. One of Apple's worst-kept secrets in recent years is the Apple Car project. Unlike most of their secret projects, building a car required the hiring of hundreds of specialty engineers outside the domain of building iPhones and Macs. So from the outside, it was really easy to track the revolving door of managers the project had over the years. But what did it look like? How did it work? What were its quirks and features? All of that was a mystery until the project was shut down and all of those employees were fired, and with nothing left to lose, the world quickly found out. The first design, known affectionately as the bread loaf, would have looked something like the Canoe EV. According to Bloomberg reporter Mark Gurman, it would have been something of a minivan crossed with a Volkswagen bus with sliding doors and a glass canopy. The cabin would have club seating like a private plane, and passengers would be able to turn some of the seats into recliners and footrests. Going all in on full autonomy, it would have no dashboard, no steering wheel, no pedals whatsoever. A second design, under the direction of Kevin Lynch, was pod-shaped, with curved glass sides that would double as gull-wing doors, and ramps that would automatically fold out for the easy loading of cargo. It was identical in the front and the back, and the designers were still so confident in full self-driving that it didn't have windows in the front or the back. Considering that to this day, no one has been able to deliver on full self-driving, it's no wonder that Apple wasn't able to make it work either. But while Apple is no longer in the game, other automakers are still trying to work the problem, to varying degrees of success. So those are some of the craziest Apple prototypes in history. Personally, I still really want an Apple Jonathan. Remember to like and subscribe. I'm Griffin Jones with Cult of Mac.